Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast. My name is David. I'm so excited that you're here. Pastor Mike is with me as always. How are you, Pastor Mike?
Good.
Episode 52. It's a year.
A year. We're a year old.
We haven't skipped a week, have we? Or doubled a week?
We've done a couple of extras in there.
But were they numbered episodes? I don't think they were numbered episodes.
I think they were called bonus episodes.
So it's been officially a year of the Grow Podcast.
1 year.
We're not gonna. Hattie's not throwing us a party for 1 year.
I about said it's hard to believe that we had that much to say, but most people who know us would not find that hard to believe at all.
I have no comment.
Yeah, you do. You're just censoring.
Well, congratulations on making it 52 episodes. It feels a little lackluster since we had a giant party for episode 50 and did a super fun episode. If you missed that episode, make sure you go check out episode 50. Hattie threw us a party.
It may be the most listened to and the longest.
Second most listened to. Our first episode.
Oh, really?
Still is the most. We had a lot of people listen to the first episode, and then they're like, "Yeah,
it was all downhill
I'm not
from
coming
there.
back for that."
Tell someone about it, because I think we've learned some things. We've gotten a little bit better.
We
along the way.
We have improved. At least slightly. At least
we have a different producer today.
We do have a different producer. We will not be bringing back the producer cam, but yeah, if it sounds better this week, then Hattie gets all the credit.
That's right.
So Hattie says it will. So she's very, very confident that the audio will be great this week. Pastor Mike, we finished a series. We're no longer in our multiplied series.
You make it sound
on the
like we never do that.
I know, it's the first time ever. We usually start them and then we just trail off, and there's no real plan. No, we finished our multiplied series.
Yes.
It was a really, really cool series.
I enjoyed that series.
It was fun to have our planning pastors teach, and then I thought your message last Sunday, not yesterday, if you're listening to this the day it comes out, but the Sunday before that was just very, very powerful way to finish it up, and just a great kind of not recap, I guess, but just a vision casting of why we're so outward focused, why we believe it's so important to multiply and plant new churches and things. And we celebrated in our service, but we have a new gathering getting started that kind of cropped out of that series too for our New Hope Here gathering. So we're very excited about that. We're very excited about that. Yeah, Pastor Mike and I actually don't talk other than on the podcast. So we're very excited about that. And it was just celebrating all of our church plants and everything during that series. It was a cool series. But now we have a new one.
We do.
Called Take a Hike.
A little behind the scenes on this, because the Grow Podcast gets behind the scenes, right?
Sure.
We had a different series planned, and
we did.
And we're still going to do that series. We're going to start it later in the summer, but just with a series of things that are happening. See what I did there? A series of things that are happening.
Wow.
You're quite the wordsmith. After the first one, people stopped listening. We just felt like we needed to step back into this series, and it's a 3-week series. And it's just something I just kind of feel like we need right now. Yeah. We're calling it Take a Hike. We probably should give credit to our
we shouldn't do that.
Other producer, Michael, for the title of this series.
We already did that on the Grow Podcast at one point.
Did we? All right.
And we also talked about how he had no idea what the series would be about. He just liked the idea of the name,
title.
Take a Hike.
Yeah. But
he did come up with it.
We're talking about going off the road. And the way I'm talking about it, if you did not join us on the weekend, is, it's vacation season. And so many of us, we get in our cars, we get in the planes, and we go from point A to point B, and then we're in, and then we're in that spot, and we only see what we see from the road. But if you stop, pull over, put your hiking shoes on, grab a water bottle, and head off on a trail, you get to see things that not as many other people see. And that's kind of the metaphor we're using for this series of talking about something very, very, very important, especially as followers of Jesus. But even few followers of Jesus get to experience it and really engage in it, and that's what I call biblical optimism. not positive thinking.
Yeah.
And not that positive thinking is a negative thing. There's a difference between positive thinking and biblical optimism, and we might get into that a little bit over the next couple of weeks. But just why we are designed and called to be optimists. And I think the title of yesterday, I said, I think. You should think I should know, right? Why I choose to be an optimist, or why I'm an optimist.
Yeah, and that was the focus of the first. And again, like Pastor Mike said, if you missed that, make sure you're joining us on the weekends. I would imagine the majority of our Grow Podcast listeners do. But if you did miss it for whatever reason, you can always find those messages, and our full New Hope Here service is always on our YouTube channel, Facebook, things like that. So make sure you go check that out. But yeah, you talked about being an optimist, which is just super easy. I'm never pessimistic about anything.
Yeah.
So I didn't really need that message at all, Pastor Mike. I just kind of checked out. But
it was good for me, and this series is real good for me because, and I share this a couple times. I'll share this a couple times in the next few weeks. I am not naturally an optimist. I mean, if you put the metaphor, the glass in front of me, I'll look at it and say, who drank half my glass? Instead of, oh, it's half full and I've still got plenty left. That's just the natural drift of my life. And I think for most of us, because of sin, it's that way. Mm-hmm. And so this is something we have to be aware of, something we have to choose. And it has to be grounded in more than, I'm just going to be a positive person. Sure. That's like saying, I'm not ever going to think about pink elephants. And suddenly that's all you're thinking of because you're focusing on not thinking about them. And we've talked about that before. We just don't have the spiritual muscle to force change in our lives. We need the Holy Spirit's help.
How often does that happen to you as a pastor where like a message or a series or whatever is particularly beneficial to you as opposed to just something you're teaching?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Probably quite a bit. There's always something that comes into play. I mean, there's some things I've taught on and I've preached on multiple times, and I have to be careful because it's a little bit like the billboard on the side of the road where, you drive by it once, you see it, you drive by it twice, you don't see it, and, third, fourth, fifth time, you don't even see it anymore until suddenly they change it, and then it's, oh, what happened? Yeah. And so with some of those things, I just have to guard against that, and I think that most people have been followers of Jesus for a while can. But there are some things that when we go into it, especially if it's something I've never taught on before, like I've never really thought about this series in this way. Mm-hmm. And I think with what all of us have experienced in the last 2 years, this is a needed. I needed it. Yeah. So if nobody else gets anything out of this series, I'm getting a lot out of this series and you just get to listen in.
Perfect.
Yeah.
What you put when you kind of send me your idea of what you want to talk about for the Grow Podcast, you usually have a title for it.
This week's an interesting title.
It's a weird one.
Yeah.
And you're not a fan of the show The Office.
No.
So initially when I saw it, I was like, "Oh, are we going to just have Office references the whole podcast?" Because I can do that. I definitely can do that.
Probably count
but you wouldn't get any of them.
Well, more than one hand, maybe two hands, the number of Office episodes that I've watched. And my family loves it.
Smart about their sense of humor. Score family.
But, yeah.
So optimism from the office floor was what it said. What does that mean?
Well, the original, and I think this came from you, but if not, we'll give you credit.
I will take it.
One of the original ideas when you guys were trying to convince me to do the podcast was, there's so much that I'm not able to talk about on the weekends because of time constraints and communication constraints that we want to kind of pick up some of those things that metaphorically get cut and just kind of left on the floor of my office and be able to share some of those things. And some weeks that slips in, but this week it definitely is that. We're just gonna, I don't know how far we'll get, but there's a bunch of stuff I didn't get to. It's not even necessarily in a thoughtful order. I wrote this sitting in my backyard as the evening breeze was blowing, which is really nice and really distracting. And it was near the end of the day, but it was just stuff that I thought, man, I would love to be able to talk about that. I think we need that, but there wasn't time on a weekend.
All right, well, go ahead and jump in then, Pastor Mike. Where are we going to start?
Well, let's start kind of at the beginning of the message from this last weekend.
Let's just rip on some pessimists.
Yeah, pessimist traps. I think one of the saddest and most frustrating things for me as a pastor is watching people who profess to be followers of Jesus get caught in traps that make them cultivate in them, is a better way to say that, cultivate in them a pessimism or even a cynicism toward the world and everything that's going on. And there's a lot of different ways that this happens. We talked about two of those traps on the weekend, the crisis du jour and the 2200, not 2020, 2200 vision. And I encourage you to go back and listen to that. But as I've been reflecting on this, when we get caught in these traps, and think about this, for those of you that have been around the church for a while, think about, hopefully not in a judgmental way. We've talked about that obviously before too, but in just an awareness of your own life, what happens in your own life, what you've observed happen in the lives of others. For people that get caught in those traps, what kind of people is that producing? And for example, I just wrote a couple of them, and I actually, since then, I've thought about probably 3 or 4 more, because it's not like it's just kind of one. But what is this producing in people? There's the kind of person who just begins to see enemies around every corner. They're almost conspiracy theorists. They're always looking for the conspiracy behind everything. My inbox gets filled up with emails from all kinds of parachurch ministries, so I believe are good and well-intended, but it's always like, you need to be aware of this, you need to be worried about this, you need to be concerned about this. And to be real blunt and honest, it's a really good fundraising tactic.
Fear.
If you're scared about that, just give, and then we'll fight against this. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be aware of what's happening in our world. I mean, Jesus talked about this, about being, as, and I'll use my language, crafty as serpents, or as wise as serpents, as some translations say, or as innocent as doves. He's saying we need to be well aware of what's happening. Yeah. But Jesus did say in 1 John chapter 2, and I read this, actually I'm going to read this next weekend. He said, there will be all kinds of people who will come against Christianity. He said, dear children, this is the last hour, as you've heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now many Antichrists is coming. Of course, we all want to know, when's the Antichrist? Who's it going to be? We're going to talk about that in the last week of this series. This is how we know it's the last hour. But if you skip further down, he says, the reason I tell you that is not to make you, not to make you scared that the Antichrist is coming. He says, remain in relationship with Jesus so that when he returns, you will be full of courage. And part of my concern for followers of Jesus who get caught in these pessimist traps and begin to see, is this president elected? Is this national leader the Antichrist? Is there begin to be so full of worry and concern instead of courage. And fear is never of God. Never of God. So if you're getting caught in a trap that is cultivating fear and anxiety, it's a trap. It's a trap, and be aware of it. I think another one of the things that it does with some people is they begin to isolate themselves. The world is getting so bad. I have to keep it away from myself and away from my friends, away from my family. One of Kylie's and my favorite movies, and it's an older movie, is called Blast from the Past. You remember this movie?
I do not.
Brendan
Producer,
Fraser.
do you remember that movie? No.
Brendan Fraser. So
we were both born a few years
after.
It actually,
not many people know this. That's one of the sources of the name of our oldest child. We just
Brendan
love the
Fraser?
name and the way he spelled it.
This is a huge unveiling, everybody. Episode 52 of the Grow Podcast.
But it's a fun movie. Starts in the 50s, kind of during the Cold War. And this family was building a bomb shelter in their backyard, and something happened. I don't want to spoil the movie. Go watch it sometime. It's kind of fun.
When did this movie come out? We don't want to spoil the 40-year-old movie.
Yeah. 90s, I think, I want to say.
Okay.
Late 90s.
I was alive then.
I'd have to look it up. And they go down and they hide out in their bomb shelter because they're convinced that a nuclear bomb fell. And they don't come back out until the 90s. And so he was a little boy when he went in. Now he's
that's interesting.
An adult, and just how he interacts with the world. He has no idea of social skills and all these kinds of things. And it's such a great example, I think, of what happens when we try to say we're going to isolate ourselves from the world, is we disconnect ourselves from it. And And, we talked at the end of the last series, Multiplied, about the priority of the mission. And I don't know any gentle way to say this. When we isolate ourselves from the world instead of connecting with it, I'm not saying conforming to it. There's a difference between connection and conforming. We are being disobedient. We're not only missing out on the opportunity to partner with God, we're being disobedient. The last thing Jesus said to us was, go into the world. Jesus' last recorded prayer for us, John chapter 17, is I want them to be in the world, not of it. So a difference between connection and conformity. In fact, in the Old Testament, I believe this refers to this. There's a Proverbs that a lot of parents quote, basically train them when they're young, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. And people think that's a promise. That's not a promise. That's a principle. And part of that, I think, is true. So like for your kids, as they grow up, train them how to interact with the world. I watch so many kids, sadly, leave college. Not that we're perfect parents. We aren't in any way, shape, or form. But leave for college, the most vulnerable time in their life. And they've never really had any interaction with lost people. And then they walk away from their faith. So I think those are two of the ways. If you begin to see yourself isolating or begin to see yourself going, there's an enemy around every corner, go back and go, am I caught in one of these traps? Am I watching the traps?
Is it normal to be have like a specialty area for your pessimism? I guess is a weird way to put it. But I feel like that's how my wife and I, she's a much more optimistic person than I am, I feel like. But when it comes to like things in our life, that's where she gets her anxiety, like financial things or just, stuff that might happen with us. She gets really anxious or, more pessimistic about. Whereas for whatever reason, I usually just like feel pretty good that things are going to work out even when they don't look great. But man, am I pessimistic about like other people and things going on in the world. That's where I bring a lot of my Is that normal, or are we just a unique
I'm not a psychologist, but
interesting.
I
would like you to not break down my psyche.
But I think we all have triggers. Something from our past. I'll share this. I think I can share this. Hopefully I don't have to ask for forgiveness later.
If there's an abrupt cut in the podcast now and we start talking about something different.
Talking about your wife, my wife, Kylie, especially in the early part of our marriage, finances created a lot of anxiety. And a lot of that is the way that she was raised. Finances were tight, and there was constant conversation about that. And so kind of the old, we always said the old recordings begin to play in her mind. Not that, her parents were warriors, but it just played into that. So I think a lot of that is stuff from our past, maybe a little bit of PTSD that plays, from certain things that play into that. Whatever. Go back to train up your child in the way they should go. Whatever you train your child, you train them so much by your example. What do you and your spouse, your wife, talk about and worry about? That's going to pass on to your kids. My friend Twyla, who Pastor Twyla, she often says, when your kids are born, start a bank account, not for their college. I mean, that's not a bad idea. But so that when they leave home, they have a counseling fund to fix all the stuff, all the things that you screwed up in them. Because there's going to be something, that... Because we aren't perfect and we pass that on.
So how do we work to avoid those pessimist traps you were talking about?
I think, first of all, be careful or even avoid listening to or reading anything that promotes fear, panic, animosity, division in you. And pay attention, because it will be different than some of us. Our friend Pastor Aaron, he, just the way he's wired, he likes a good controversy sometimes.
Not Pastor Aaron.
But there are some things he can listen to, and they fire him up in kind of a, get him fired up for the kingdom and that. And I'm going, I can't listen to or read that stuff. It just it sends me down the wrong path. So I'm just careful with this. There are certain speakers that I won't listen to or read. Not that they're bad, but it's
Pastor Tom Lundeen.
No, he's not one of them.
Just checking, Dad.
But that it seems like they're always talking about what's negative in the world. They're caught in the trap themselves. I think second thing is, and this helps me, read and memorize. And we don't like that M word. Memorize God's promises. And I would say, not that we don't need to be aware of prophecy, and we'll talk about that at the end of the last week in this series. But if we're spending more time studying prophecy than we are memorizing and digging into his promises, it's going to create the wrong effect. The prophecies are meant to produce courage and hope, not fear and worry. And so, but they need to be grounded in promises. And here's the third thing. Make sure you're befriending and have real discussions with spiritually lost people.
Why would that keep me optimistic?
I think, part of it you're going to have to balance it. I think it keeps you connected in credibility. So here's where we'll talk about these next few weeks. When we start getting caught up in fear, worry, pessimism, we begin to drift into what I think the greatest oxymoron. I called it that this last weekend, Christian pessimism. And God never intended for us to be pessimists. He didn't intend for us to pretend everything's okay. We'll talk more about that next week. But when you begin to interact with people who are genuinely spiritually lost and begin to hear their questions and begin to hear their perspective on Christianity, it will change your perspective, and you'll begin to think about the things that God wants you to think about. Remember, our priority is the mission instead of all of this negative stuff we get caught in. And you'll realize that when we begin to compromise our faith and get into pessimism, it affects our credibility. It is very difficult for me to talk to a person about how much they need Jesus when I'm scared all the time.
Yeah.
Or when I'm angry all the time. Or when I'm fighting the latest bill from Congress. Not that I shouldn't vote against some of those things. We do have a responsibility. But I need to be talking to my friends who know Jesus from the perspective of, this is not ultimately my home. And I know the God who is at work. And no, it's not good right now, but it will be. Yeah. And I think the other thing, it keeps you from being isolated.
Sure.
I think there's a difference between isolation and insulation. Insulation is making sure I guard my heart. Isolation is keeping everything at a distance because I think it might hurt me. Well, we'll make mistakes and we'll get hurt from time to time. That's why we have an amazing healing God.
I think that you said it 30 seconds ago, but having that focus on this is not my home could just be so helpful for so many of us in this, because it's so easy to get pessimistic when this thing I don't like is happening to my country or happening to my city or happening to my church or my school or whatever. And it seems like that's the most important thing in your life because that's what you see, that's where you are. But then having that, 10,000 foot view or whatever they always say, from above, where you're like that's might be where I am, but it's not my home. It's not the most important thing. There's this much, much greater thing. And when you have that perspective, it's so much easier to be like, okay, like you said, I should still vote and I should still, be engaged in these things that are happening and care about those, but those are so much less important than, like you said, the mission. And, like going back to our last series, Multiplied, excuse me, I just love, you closed it by talking about how, the first priority of the church is to multiply, it's to share. And so that should be my first priority in my life. My first priority shouldn't be fixing this, thing that I don't like about the culture that I live in the United States. It should be to multiply. It should be to help the church grow, because the church growing means that more people are coming to know who Jesus is. Yeah.
And, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about our community. Yep. I love the community that I live in. I love the country that I live in. I'm so proud of so much of our country and what it has stood for. We are not perfect, and there's other things I'm not proud of, and would love to change. And I believe in it to a point. There are some things that that our country and community stands for, would I give my life for them? Absolutely. But not in the name of Christ, in the name of I believe these things, because my citizenship is in another, is in another world, another kingdom. There are times he will ask me to I was going to say something there, and now it's gone. So, yeah.
Well, now to help us all avoid pessimism, Pastor Mike is going to list all of the things he doesn't like about America.
Yeah.
So if you could just jump in.
Yeah. Yeah. This is real. This is live. So I'm talking, and then suddenly it's like, I don't remember what I was going to say. But I think, regardless of where you live, engage in your country as part of that. But when things don't go your way, it's not spelling the end of the church or the end of the world. Yeah. And we talked about that Sunday. We're going to talk about that more the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. And not minimizing God as well. Like he's so much more powerful than whatever this thing that's making me feel pessimistic, making me worry, giving me anxiety. He's bigger than that.
Yeah.
Just sing the old VeggieTales song, God is bigger than the boogeyman.
Yeah.
Neither of us are going to sing it because we would like you to stay with us at the Grow podcast. But
well, I would encourage you, if you struggle with this, whether it's with country or personally, go back to this last weekend and write down particularly the 3 things from the 2 stories and the promise that we talked about. God's kingdom does not need me to grow. He wants me to be involved in it. Don't judge the future based upon the present. And remember, we are not the ones under attack. Are we in a battle? Yes.
Yeah.
But it's ultimately the enemy of our souls who's the one under attack, who is under attack, and that's why he's battling against us. So because he knows he has convinced himself he's not in a losing battle, but he is in a losing battle.
He's optimistic about it.
Yeah. There's nothing optimistic about the enemy.
Let's not dive into that.
Yeah.
I do want to ask you, and we're going to wrap up real quick, so touch on it fast. But you just said, that God doesn't need us to grow the kingdom, but he wants to do that with us. Why? And why does it sometimes it feels like, well, man, if I don't, we talk about we just talked about a gathering at the beginning of the podcast, and we say there's people that might never be introduced to Jesus. You might be the person God put in their life to tell them. If he doesn't need me, then why does it happen that way? Why am I allowed to screw it up?
And the Bible,
there's my pessimistic thing.
The Bible talks about it with urgency.
Right.
I mean, Jesus said, raise your eyes and look at the harvest fields that are white. Pray then that the Lord will send more workers in the harvest. Yep. Paul wrote in Romans, how will they know unless someone tells them, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. Mm-hmm. It talks about bringing the gospel to a lost world with urgency because it is urgent.
Right.
It is urgent. And I'm trying to remember, I think it was Billy Graham, but I think it was actually somewhere before him. We was talking about prayer, but really talking about the harvest is, we pray and work as if everything depends upon us, but we live in peace knowing it doesn't. And one of the things we need to realize, God invites us to partner with him. He wants us to partner with him, and he's designed the advancement of the kingdom to advance in partnership with us. If he didn't want us involved, once we ask for him to forgive us of our sins, he would just take us home.
Yeah.
But he leaves us here, and knowing that we'll mess some things up once in a while, but he partners with us. And that's the incredible thing is, will we mess some things up? Will we cause damage? Yes. I mean, all we have to do is look back in history. We can talk about moments in history where the church has done damage. Church still does damage. But none of that has ever stopped the church. God's kingdom always advances somehow, some way. It may be messier because of us. That doesn't shock or surprise God. For me, one of the things, and we talked about this Sunday, is I want to be involved with him in the place that he's designed for me to be involved with him. I don't want him to go, I'm going to hand your mission off to someone else. Because I want to do what God has designed for me to do. That's where I'm going to find my greatest fulfillment in life. That's where I'm going to grow the most. He's designed it not just to be about other people, but to grow me. I never we talked about this a couple weeks ago, never wanted to be a senior pastor. And still some days, but I've never grown more.
Sure.
never grown more, and never felt more in partnership with God. Not because I'm amazing, but because he's amazing to be able to use someone like me.
Yeah.
And it's part of how he teaches us relationship. Connecting with people who don't understand, and we grow with them, and we conflict with them, and all those other kinds of things. And we can just go through scripture of different people from Abraham, who was promised to be part of God's amazing thing, and he screws it up. He and Sarah get ahead of God. We aren't having kids, and then they only have really one child. Joseph, who's promised by God to be this amazing leader, and brags to his brothers, gets thrown in jail. You got to wonder if that would have happened differently. We don't know.
Yeah.
We could list King Saul, the first king of Israel, and God had to take him out because he got off track.
Yeah.
David, a man after God's own heart, and all we have to say is the name Bathsheba, and yet God still uses him.
Yeah.
And we could go we go on and on and on, the nation of Israel, and on and on and on. The illustration I have is I love to do yard work, and my yard work's I'm gonna do my yard work regardless. But I really like it when my boys help me. Not always because I need their help, but because I like doing it with them. And now I'm not God, obviously.
Thank you for that clarification.
With them with me, it means we have more effort and more hands.
Sure.
God doesn't need me.
Right.
But he loves to have us walk through this with him. And at the end, we get to look back and say, look what we were part of with him. Same thing with my boys from the yard.
Your relationship with them grows. They learn. All those things happen.
Yeah.
Well, we have a lot more we could talk about, but we're already longer than we normally like to go on the Grow podcast. So do you have homework for us? What's our quick fix to make sure we're only ever optimistic?
I think just ask yourself where your focus is. I'm not going to give you a date. Ask yourself where your focus is right now. What is being cultivated in you? Fear and anxiety, or peace and hope and faith? And if it's not the second, don't beat yourself up about it. Just check your focus. Check your focus. And I gave some of those things in the weekend teaching about how to check your focus.
Did you want to say check your heart right there, but John Christ ruined that phrase for you? So.
No, I didn't even cross my mind, but that's good.
All right. Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. Thanks to all of you for joining us again on the Grow podcast for a year of growing on the podcast.
Your next step. Or your growth always I about screwed that up.
That's why I say it every week, even though you came up with it.
Yeah.
But growth always starts with the next step. So tremendous job taking your next step of listening to the Grow podcast, and now find a new next step. So check your focus this week and see where that focus is at. And let's make sure we are avoiding Christian pessimism this week. And we will see you next time.